is there anything about us that lasts forever? Is there anything about us that lasts forever? I mean, that's exactly what Jesus and the Sadducees are really talking about in Luke chapter 20. But before we get there, what do we already know for sure? Well, just to name one thing, we know that physically speaking, nothing lasts forever, right? Our bodies, well, they have a very narrow window, usually in our late 20s or early 30s, when they are both fully developed, but also not in decline. Sorry, guys, most of us are past it, right? Now, our brains are a bit different. On one hand, yes, our ability to think quickly and to remember the most, it's strongest in the same time period, our late 20s, our early 30s. But at the same time, there are some mental traits that we can continue to improve, even well beyond middle age. Our vocabulary, for instance, our accumulated knowledge, our expertise, they actually tend to hit their peak sometime in our 50s or 60s. So a few more of us, we got that to look forward to, right? And our wisdom, that is our ability to understand and to empathize and to make good judgments. I mean, that can continue to grow even as we age beyond that. But even our brains are anything but eternal. Just like every other part of our body, they age and they decay. And all of this, I think, pushes us up against an uncomfortable question. And it's this: if we are only physical beings, that is, beings without any spiritual center, like a soul, I mean, just how is it that we can even maintain a sense of self over time, much less eternity? And this is actually a very old question. We're not geniuses for discovering it and puzzling about it. The philosopher Plutarch, he asked this all the way back at the time of Jesus. And he uses this interesting illustration to kind of get to the heart of the matter. He writes that there was a very old ship in the city of Athens, supposedly owned by the hero Theseus. And he says that, well, the Athenian state, they maintained that ship for hundreds of years as an artifact of their founding. But Plutarch goes on. He says, over those years, the wood of the ship of Theseus would rot, and the ropes of the rigging, they'd fray, and the sails would decay and fall off. And as they did so, Plutarch says, well, the Athenians would carefully replace them with new ones made to the specifications of the old. And the question that Plutarch asks is this. He says, was it still the ship of Theseus? Even though over hundreds of years, every original part and piece had been replaced at some time by a new one. And you know, we can ask the same question about our physical bodies, right? How am I still Peter, even though nearly every part of me has been replaced repeatedly at the cellular level over my 49 years of life? How does that work? Well, there are attempts to answer this. I mean, maybe our sense of self, our core of identity over time, it persists, even though the stuff of self, our bodies, is constantly being replaced because maybe there's a lot of redundancy built into our brains. We just kind of can move things around. That's true to a point. Blind people, for instance, can sometimes repurpose their visual cortex to read Braille. But is that enough, really, to explain why, even after several total replacements of almost all the matter that makes me, I can still feel in my gut this morning the exact same feeling that I felt when I learned that my third grade friend Aaron had died? Or maybe we can maintain our sense of self because that is stored not so much in individual cells or neurons, but but in the complex pattern that they make when they fire together. That is, maybe our brains are kind of like one of those signs made up of thousands of light bulbs. Individual light bulbs, they can come and go, but the larger pattern persists. Okay? But neither of these insights, neither of them address the question of just why our physical brains respond the way they do to the information we perceive, and particularly respond the way they do to information we perceive that connects us to the past in some way. I mean, why? Why, 40 years later, do I still feel that same ache for Aaron? Or why do I feel love for my daughters that goes deeper than memory or biology? Science can give us some insight into the process here, but it cannot explain the mystery of being human through time, much less eternity. But here's some good news. You see, as Christians, we can and we do go further than that. We have more to say. And we can and do go further because we know there's more to us than just the physical stuff we are made of. Friends, we are not just the wood and sails and rope of the ship of Theseus. Always different than we were yesterday, but somehow mysteriously in a way we cannot make sense of, the same as well. We have a soul. And our soul is not just ourself or our memories. It is a God-given life that connects us to Him. And a life that reaches beyond our physical limits and even beyond our death. I mean, that's what Job is referring to in our Old Testament reading today when he looks ahead to his death and he imagines himself after death meeting God. He says, after my skin has been thus destroyed, after the physical matter I am made up of is destroyed. And this is why Jesus, he ends his confrontation with the Sadducees, who Luke helpfully tells us are those who deny the resurrection, who thought that all there was our physical bodies. That's why he ends his confrontation with them with that mic drop observation where he says in verse 38 of Luke chapter 20, "Now God is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live in him." And that's why earlier this week when two of our friends here at Epiphany, Phoebe Greenwood and Gary Efaw, died, we can both grieve the loss of their physical presence, the stuff that they were made of, but also have good hope that Gary and Phoebe continue with God. And it's also why we can set down for ourselves all the unsuccessful efforts that we make to assure our own immortality. Now you may say, wait a second, how am I trying to assure my own immortality? But the reality is that there's ways we do this, right? And actually, it's a significant side effect of believing that we have a soul to say we don't have to do so much of it. So how do people pursue immortality today? How do they do that? Now, we're kind of moving into a brave new world with AI and things like that, so I don't know anything about that. So I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to stick with traditional ways to pursue immortality. And one of the ways people do it, people with resources, is they do things like they build buildings and get them named after themselves, right? Or they set up endowments for causes that they believe in. So at least something of who they were lives on, even if their body doesn't. And this kind of works, right? In a limited way. For instance, we all know Alfred Nobel's name, even though he died in 1896. And the wild thing is that even though what Alfred Nobel did in life was invent and sell vast amounts of military-grade explosives that killed entire armies, we don't remember him for that. But we remember him for the immortality he bought for himself, the Nobel Prize. I mean, not only did he buy some immortality, but he even managed to radically change his reputation. That's amazing, really. And you know, people have always pursued this sort of immortality. They even do it in the Bible. Sometimes they did it exactly the way that Alfred Nobel did it, by building something and putting their name on it. Temples were a very popular way to buy that sort of immortality. That's why there's all the discussions in the Old Testament about who builds the temple. That is, of course, what King Herod was doing when he built the temple of Jesus' day. So that's one way you can attempt to buy immortality. But there's a problem, right? You got to be rich. What about for those who don't have the resources to buy a temple or build a thing? Well, there actually was another way, a much more accessible way, a way that I think is still with us today. And that was building or buying immortality through your family. Through your family. And that's actually a really important part of the context of Luke chapter 20 this morning. It's the argument underneath the argument, so to speak. And if you want to look at this with me, this is on page 880 in the Blue Bibles, Luke chapter 20. And here's the basic idea, and I think we kind of know this because it's still around, of pursuing immortality through our families. The idea is something like this. Yes, each of us will die, but so long as we have descendants, we have sons or daughters, there is some kind of us carrying forward in them, in their, you want to talk about it at a cellular level, in their DNA, so to speak. And that's actually the point. That is actually the point of this purposely ridiculous string of 7 childless marriages that the Sadducees confront Jesus with here in Luke. That's why in verse 28 they say, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother died, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." I mean, otherwise, why would anyone do this? The awkwardness of this situation is just through the roof. If you doubt me, stop for a moment. Wives, think about your brother-in-law. Like I said, I see that. I see that right there. But we must understand its purpose. This sort of marriage is called a levirate marriage. I haven't looked up to why that word is there. A levirate marriage. It's not actually to establish some sort of marital bliss between a widow and her brother-in-law. The purpose was actually to give the dead brother the only kind of immortality that seemed possible. That is descendants, to carry forward his family name. That's why you do this. That's why there is this in the Bible as an option, so to speak. It is a way to carry forward a family name. So that actually is what Jesus is commenting on and rejecting when he undercuts the entire scenario here in verses 34 and 35, where he says, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. Why? To preserve some kind of immortality. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Friends, Jesus is saying this not because he is keen to bust up your earthly marriage when you get to heaven. He's saying it because we don't need to seek immortality through our family. That's what he's getting at. We have a better immortality, he's saying, because we have a soul and we'll be resurrected. I mean, Jesus says this right here. The argument goes here. You can see that in verse 36. He says, for they cannot die anymore. It's fixed the problem that a levirate marriage was aimed at. So friends, how are we seeking immortality? Or maybe, just where do our fears reside about losing it? This morning would be a good time to face both those fears and our hopes squarely and honestly. First, the fear. Yes, if all we are is physical, there is no real immortality for us to find. Full stop. we age, we decay. Ultimately, our physical bodies stop working. They shut down and they die. No diet or exercise plan can save you. Which I take some comfort in, actually. So I'm really bad at both of those. But not only that, but the workarounds that we have available, some way that we can maybe get a little bit of immortality for ourselves, well, guess what? They don't work very well either. It's true that Alfred Nobel or King Herod, they try the approach of buying their immortality through good works or great building projects. But it doesn't work in the end. Governments change. Herod's great temple did not outlast his great-grandson. And it's also true that our humbler, family-based immortality that sometimes we can seek today, well, it doesn't work either. As many of us have learned the hard way, living vicariously through our kids is, well, problematic in this life, much less for eternity. But what if? What if we put our hopes for our eternal life where Jesus puts them, where he points us this morning in Luke 20? What if we put them in God? Now, he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live in him. I mean, what would that look like? Well, it would mean, as we did this week here at Epiphany, saying our farewells with those who die with good hope that our parting is not forever. It would mean that when it comes time for us to die, we can say our farewells then with good hope that our parting is not forever as well. It would mean that even as we see our bodies and sometimes our brains decay, we recognize that there is more to us than the stuff we're made of. Thanks be to God for that. And it would mean less need for efforts to secure our good names, our reputations, and our families, and our significance in this life on the world's terms, and more need to look to the one who secures our souls for the life to come. Friends, getting your name on a plaque on a building somewhere is a pretty darn cheap form of immortality. We can choose something better. So let's rest from our striving to make ourselves immortal, however we might pursue that. Let's set down our anxious efforts to somehow make our names outlast us. And let's place our lives and our deaths in the hands of the living God. All live to him. Amen.